is a master document of Unit 1. And so I'll be going through it, and that's basically it. And I'll be giving my own kind of case studies or ideas in my head while we go along with it. Yes, the session will be recorded and will be shared afterwards. And you'll also get a copy of this document as well. It's pretty hefty though, but it has a lot compiled in it, which is good. So it's like a pretty good compilation of Unit 1 with case studies, with maps, with figures. So I got you guys covered. Let's just say that. We'll just say that. But yes, it is 10. I'll begin because I don't want to, because it's a pretty hefty document, so I don't want to take I don't want to take too much of your guys' time as well as my own. But if anyone joins later, we can fill them in if they have any questions. So, okay, I'll begin. So, welcome to the Unit 1 Geography Review. I'm Lolwa. I'm a current DP2 or IB2. So my exams are also in a few weeks. I'm from Lebanon originally. However, I currently study in China. So a lot of my case studies or a lot of the information I have in my head will be relative to one of the two locations. What my intended objective today is to go over the content for you for this chapter because it's very hefty. But at the same time, I want to focus on stimulus response, like how you respond to maps, to graphs, how to analyze them, what to interpret from them. And also, I want to give you guys good case studies for you to remember for your papers. And if you're an HL student, it could also help you for your paper 3s for stimulus, and for synthesis, and for paper 2 in general for your essays. Case studies can always go such a long way. So I made sure to compile a list of case studies for each relevant chapter. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat. I'll be there to respond, but we also have our other two amazing geo tutors to respond as well. And without further ado, let's begin. This is my favorite chapter. That's why I begged to tackle this. This is my favorite to cover. It was the first one I took. And my teachers always told me to remember to look at things through a speed lens. Don't mind the spelling mistake over there. Through a speed lens. Speed means social, political, environmental, economic, and demographic. That's how I get to remember all of these. It's basically when coming up with an essay outline or when analyzing a situation, it's good to look at it through these 5 different perspectives. It really helps me format my essay and also helps me diversify my point of view or diversify my answers. So that's like how some things will be categorized throughout the document in speed. Not all of them, but sometimes 3 or 4. It's a really great way to analyze a case study, to analyze a question, especially for an essay. Look at it through speed. That's the main thing. And so we'll start with Unit 1.1, which is population and economic development patterns. And so let's start with global population distribution. As we all know, there are two factors that impact population distribution. You have physical factors and human factors. So, population distribution in general is the pattern of which people have organized themselves to live. Global distribution, however, is uneven because less than a third of the Earth's surface is land and inhabitable. And 5% of that land supports 75% of our population. And most of the people live within 1,000 kilometers of the sea. 80% of the population lives in the northern hemisphere, and 90% of the population live on low ground below 500 meters above sea level. Density is the number of people living in a certain area. It's measured in population per kilometer squared. And approximately 55% of the world now lives in cities because of urbanization, but this figure is projected to reach 65% by 2050. And then you also have population change. That is how the population increases or decreases over time. The thing is that the population is never static. So population always changes. The distribution, the density, and the number are constantly evolving due to various processes and external factors. So here's an example of a map. I highly suggest to look at this website. It's called Our World in Data. It really helps you look at maps of current trends happening around the world, or globally in a global scale. It really helps to also understand how to read maps, because for some questions you will have to interpret a map and try and describe what's going on, describe the trend. And so, as you can see here, it shows you both the population spread, but also by per population density. A way to describe this is to describe trends or what you're seeing. So, for example, I would say that multiple countries in Southern Asia have really high population density, ranging from 200 to 1,000 people per kilometer squared. And then that is similarly found in Central Europe. However, in places such as Australia and Canada, you could see a smaller population density with around 2 to 5, or actually 0 to 5 people per kilometer squared. So that's how you would describe a map. You would talk about the trends, and then at the same time, you can point out anomalies, which are like key points of data that are sticking out or that aren't usual. So, for example, you'd say that Algeria, no, that's not Algeria. You'd say that Libya or Canada or Australia can be seen as anomalies, or Mongolia for the really small number. And you can also say that other countries with higher numbers, such as Nigeria, would be another anomaly. So you can talk about that in regards to where they are. And if you have any further questions, I can explain that further later on. But that's it for the map so far. And an exam tip, however, if you're asked to describe population density and distribution in the exam, remember, they're not the same. However, they are pretty similar, but they're not the same. Because density refers to the actual number of people living in an area per kilometer squared, and distribution refers to where. So distribution refers to the how, or like where they're spread, and density talks about the numbers, or like the quantitative data. So, for example, population distribution is uneven, but then their density is like, the density is the specific numbers and the distribution is the spread in general, if that makes sense. So there are two factors, as I said before, there are both human and physical factors that influence the distribution of populations. So the physical factors that affect global distribution are: one, climate and weather. So areas that have temperate climates with stable weather conditions are more attractive. Areas with even sunlight, temperature, and precipitation as well. And areas that are very dry, very cold, or very wet will have varying populations, so it's not too clear. You also have relief and landforms. You have soil types and soil quality. So, for example, volcanic areas can be highly attractive due to their fertile soil and resources. You also have vegetation. So grasslands are more attractive. You have natural resources such as fresh water, raw materials, and minerals. You have natural hazards, and you also have location. For example, areas that are difficult to access or have poor communications will be less attractive to places that have closer connections with other areas, or that are easier to access. Human factors. You have economic development, so areas with higher level of income, trade, industrialization tend to attract more people. Political stability, as with lower levels of conflict, violence, and corruption tend to be more peaceful and secure. And you can also say the opposite, that areas with higher levels of conflict, violence, and corruption tend to be less peaceful and discourages population growth. You also have cultural diversity. Areas with more diverse and tolerant cultures tend to be more attractive. Social factors, you have areas with better access to education, healthcare, social welfare, tend to have a higher quality of life, lower mortality rates. You also have environmental awareness, so areas with more awareness and action on environmental issues tend to have lower levels of pollution, and you also have historical factors. So one worked example or an exam type question is outline 2 physical factors that can lead to human settlement. These are usually worth 4 marks. So with 4 marks, that means you have to describe 4 distinct qualities. So for example, you have 2 favorable factors, which are river valleys and flat fertile grasslands, plains with good water and silt supplies, and then you develop the question for a further 1 point, which is areas should not be too steep or at high altitudes and have a climate that is not too extreme. So this is a sample answer, and you can use the information above to kind of work out your answer. So you also, now let's move on to global patterns of economic development. So development is a process of positive change where a country becomes wealthier and more technologically advanced. It refers to a positive change in people's quality of life, such as happiness, educational opportunities, increased income, human rights, access to clean water, and healthier living conditions. There are different strands of development, and as you can see here, we worked on speed. So environmental, where natural environments are improved, political, where the government is more stable, social, standards of living is improved, and economic, you have better income, employment, and industry. There are different ways to measure development, of course. There are the traditional 3 ways, which is GDP, GNI, and the poverty line. So GDP is the gross domestic product, which is the total value of the economy in a country per year. The GNI is the gross national income. It's the total value of goods and services produced. And you have the poverty line, which is the percentage of people who earn less than 2.15 US dollars per day, as set by the World Bank in 2022. This divided countries into the rich or poor, like the global north and the global south, but however, it did not take account the scale or change of wealth. So then the World Bank decided to categorize economies into income groupings per capita. So you have low income, middle income, and high income countries. However, globally, there's an uneven distribution of high, middle, and low countries. Around 10% of the world live in countries where the average income is less than $2 a day, and around 20 are in high income countries, and the majority is around 70%. So there is the growing middle class. And then here is here's a map of the World Bank classification of countries and how they're distributed around the world. So here it is. And most HICs as you can see, most HICs are found in the Northern Hemisphere, which includes Canada, USA, Japan. However, there are anomalies such as Chile, Australia, Uruguay, and New Zealand, which are classified as high-income countries in the Southern Hemisphere. And most LICs are found between the tropics and concentrated within Africa and alongside some parts of Asia. MICs vary by region, by size, by income level. For example, Belize and Marshall Islands have small populations, whereas the 5 BRICS countries account for 27% of the world's land surface. So they do vary in sizes. However, they're in the same categories. So classification of economic development. At an international level, the development of country has been categorized, as we said earlier, to one of the 3 groups: low, medium, or high income countries. So they'd be either developing, less economically developed, or more economically developed. However, the categories do not account for varying levels of development at a local and national scale. They tend to generalize this into more of an international scale. And with that, there are differences between areas of the same city, the same country, and even between countries. And the difference between levels of development is known as the development gap. And development is hard to measure. However, it is measured using indicators. And so we have different types of indicators. You have social indicators, economic indicators, and political indicators. So examples of social is you measure quality of life, equal opportunities, life expectancy, birth control, education, diversity, and heritage. For economy, you measure employment, income, general wealth, savings, resources, pollution, etc. For politics, or for the political condition in general, you look at effective governance, corruption index, ease of trade, property rights, so on and so forth. So there are different ways to measure the development of a country, and they're separated into these three categories. So they're either social indicators, economic indicators, and political indicators. And there are different ways to also measure development, as I said. And the traditional measures, the traditional method of measuring wealth is, like we said before, by either GNP, GDP, or GNI. But here's a breakdown of all of them, which you can look at. It's their definitions, how are they measured, and how good it is to measure development. So you have the GDP, GDP per capita, gross national income per head, and then the Human Development Index. So individual indicators are kind of misleading when they're used alone. However, by using multiple indicators together, it is as a measure of development, a clearer picture is produced. So with that, let's look at a case study together. It's a case study of China, and we'll go over it in depth in terms of population growth and how its population is distributed both internationally and in a regional scale. So let's look at China. So China has a very large land area. It's a huge number. It's located in East Asia. 27% is desert, 33% is mountainous. It is the second most populous country in the world. I don't know right now how it's going, but at the time it was 1.42 billion people. 10% of the population live on less than 1% of the available land, and the life expectancy is 74 years for men, 79 for women. So the case study is there is uneven distribution in China. China has a wide variation in population distribution and GPT per capita by province. Mostly concentrated in the southeastern part of the country, you have Beijing and Shanghai, who have the highest GDP per capita. Eastern China is easier to develop due to its flat plains and because it's also bordering the ocean. You have the Yangtze River and the Yellow River, which provide water for farmland and for cities. You have 4 provinces who have a really large GDP per capita, and Western China is leaded, and that is due to, along with the plateau, and these regions receive little to no rainfall, and they are high enough to see extreme temperatures. And so here is a visual breakdown of China's GDP per capita per province. As you can see, the provinces in Eastern China have higher GDPs, and then Western China have smaller GDPs per capita in each province. And so you also have core periphery models. So the provinces along East China can be regarded as the economic core of China. So they're the central economic hubs of the country. And most secondary and tertiary economic activities are located there. So tourism and manufacturing. The economic periphery is to the west and far northeast of China, so which includes the deserts. So if you just a reminder, periphery core. The core is the center of the economy or economic businesses in the country. So as you can see here, Eastern China is the core. And then the periphery, which is, for example, the borders or the outside, would be Western China. So as you'll see later that migration patterns will go from the periphery to the core, so from the less economically active parts of China to the more economically active parts of China, for improved job opportunities and livelihood. That later. However, you can see that there's a developmental gap in a range of areas. So 17 million people still live on $2.30 US a day. Over 90% are living in poverty, and they live in rural areas. And the standard of housing is often poor because people are being moved to apartment blocks to free up land for factories. Over 25% of rural households have access to piped water, and literacy rates in rural areas are 65. However, in urban areas, they are 84. And the rate of unemployment is over 30% in rural areas. So what does that lead to? That leads to increased poverty, difficulty in attracting businesses to the West. the periphery is becoming more dependent on primary economic activities such as agriculture to survive. And then this regional inequality has led to significant rural-urban migration. So as I was saying before, this is a breakdown of the core periphery model. It's basically flows towards the core is greater than flows to the periphery. And so if you think about this in terms of human migration, you'd see that the core is an area with more economic livelihood, or there's more economic activity, whereas the periphery is with less. So you'll see people move from the periphery to the core for enhanced job opportunities, and then you'll see elderly people usually move from the core to the periphery for retirement or for easier, quieter living, for example. So people are drawn from the periphery to the core, both resources such as people and materials. And then you have the semi-periphery in the middle. So let's talk about the internal migration. As I said earlier, the majority of the migrants are economically active, mostly female, from rural areas and poor communities, and they're considered a floating population as they don't have official urban hukou status. So you don't have to know that in specific, but urban hukou status is like urban residency. It's like a residency permit that proves that you're an official resident of that part of China, of that city. So here is a map to break down the internal migration scheme. So basically, as you can see, most of the arrows go from central China to the east, or to the borders of the coastline of China, and that shows how mostly in the workplace or when people are searching for improved economic livelihood, they will move from the periphery to the core. And as you can see, for China, the core is the coastline. And you see that around 20 million people arrive in cities each year. More than 200 million rural migrants now work in China's main cities, such as Shanghai and Shenzhen. And over the next decade, an estimated 60% of Chinese people will live in urban areas due to this ongoing incident of rural-urban migration. And so this leads to megacity growth in China, because approximately 56% of the world's 8 billion people now live in cities, and China has more than 100 of them, and 6 of them are considered megacities with over 10 million people each. And there are 5 economic zones, 17 open cities, and so this rural-urban migration is basically leading to an increase in megacity growth in China, both in the growth of new megacities and the growth of pre-existing megacities. And so another case study would be South Africa. South Africa's population distribution is quite similar, but also unique on its own. It is the second most populous country in the south of the equator after Tanzania. It's approximately 69% of it is urban. The median age in South Africa is 27.6. Average life expectancy is 60 for men and 66 for women. And the climate is mostly semi-arid. South Africa has 3 capitals: Pretoria, Cape Town, and Bloemfontein. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. And then there's a lot of ethnic distribution. The eastern half is more densely populated than the west. And here is a map of the distribution of South Africa's population. So again, as you can see, it is mostly densely populated around the coastline. And you can see that the pattern is that that South Africa is mostly densely populated in its mega cities, or it's like its big cities such as Cape Town and Johannesburg, and on the coastline. And here is a percentage of population by province and a percentage of GDP per province. And as you can see, the areas with larger or higher percentages of population have higher percentages of GDP, if you compare the two. And so as you can see here, you have different population densities per provinces in South Africa. A clear anomaly is, of course, Gauteng, which has 830.6 people per square kilometers. And then for the economic distribution, Finance is the biggest industry in Gauteng and the Western Cape. Mining dominates in Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Northwest, and the Northern Cape. KwaZulu-Natal's major industry is manufacturing, and there are a lot of government services which are focused in Eastern Cape and Free State. So different parts of South Africa have different industries that they focus on. And then for core periphery in South Africa, Gauteng has the largest and is the core of South Africa and dominates with finance. And the economic periphery is to the northwest. So people migrate from the northwest of South Africa to Gauteng. South Africa has some of the highest levels of inequality, and the development gap can be seen in a range of areas. So 18.2 million people are living in extreme poverty in South Africa with less than $2.15 a day. 20% of the population holds over 68% of income, with 40% seeing just 7% of income. In some areas, the unemployment rate in rural areas is over 30%. So this leads to increased poverty, difficulty attracting businesses to these regions. The periphery is becoming even more dependent, similar to China, on primary economic activities such as agriculture, and regional inequality has led to significant rural-urban migration within South Africa. So the internal migration in South Africa, you can see that colonialism created economic centers, which in turn brought continued uneven development in the country. So after the apartheid in South Africa, internal migration was driven by economics, where the majority of South Africans moved from the poorer provinces to the richer ones, and from rural areas to the cities. So 4 provinces experienced negative net migration, which means most people are leaving these areas in order to go to the more economically active parts. And so there's been a lot of internal migration pre and post apartheid. So young Black men were allowed to move to the cities. Sorry. One sec. Okay. So urbanization grew after the end of apartheid, with Johannesburg seeing the largest increase of rural to urban migration. And then for international migration, wait, give me one sec. Okay, back. For international migration, though, most Africans are escaping from violence and tend to seek security and prosperity elsewhere. So, of the world's 17 million displaced Africans, 3% are in Europe, and the number of displaced people in Africa has increased by around 20% due to the unresolved crises in Libya, South Sudan, CAR, northern Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Cameroon. Overall, the Rainbow Nation of South Africa has attracted 3.2 million migrants, and most migrants are from neighboring countries, but also Morocco or Eritrea, heading towards Johannesburg. And so here is a map of how there was forced migration due to apartheid. And an exam tip, of course, is try and include examples or specific detail in all of your exams. So, for example, if you're asked to write a definition or a meaning, providing an example shows your understanding and also secures that mark, particularly if your definition isn't perfect. So, for example, if you're asked to define migration, you could say migration is when people move from one region to another region. This can be internal, such as Free State to urban Gauteng in South Africa, or international, such as South Sudanese to South Africa, escaping the civil unrest. So get into the habit of using your case studies in any question where you think they might help you explain them, and don't just keep them for your essays if possible. And so now let's look at changing population in places. So you have the demographic transition models, and since the industrial revolution, no 2 countries' populations have changed in the same way. Everyone's changing differently. However, you do have some similarities in their population growth patterns. So this model illustrates 5 stages of population change that countries pass through as they industrialize. It shows how birth rates and death rates change over time, and its effects on the overall population. Also, before I continue on to the second part, does anyone have any questions about the first part? Does anyone need me to clarify anything about everything I said earlier, or is everyone fine with me moving on to the next part? Whew. I know there's a lot, so I just want to make sure everyone is okay before we move on. Yeah, for sure. Let me go back to that one. Perfect. So here you go. I'll leave it up on the screen as well if you want to read it yourself. But I can also explain it again. So because of a lot of a lot of crises happening across Africa, South Africa has become a major hub for displaced people across the continent to go to. So you have refugees from countries such as Libya, South Sudan, northern Mozambique, and Ethiopia coming to South Africa for refuge in times of their conflict. And so they are a country of centralized migration within the continent. So yes. Let me know when it's all good. All right. If anyone else has any other questions, then just let me know. We can clarify anything before moving on so that we just move on with ease. Of course, no worries about it. All right. If no one else has any concerns, then we can move on to the next part, which is population distribution. So you have the demographic transition models, the DTMs, and this is how it usually looks like. As you can see, there is 3 curves. You have the birth rate, you have the death rate, and you have the total population curve. And these show the transition of the population from high birth and high death rates to lower and more stable rates over time. And so there are 5 stages over here, as you can see. I'll skim through them. So you have 5 stages, with one being the most chaotic or unstable, with very high trends or very high birth rates and high death rates, with all the way up to number 5 being the one with the decline in birth rate and death rates. So here is a breakdown of it. I'll let you guys read this. It basically shows how each of the different stages show different phases of population growth. Let me see. Oh no, I don't have a picture. So I'll give you guys a picture later. So an explanation though of why there are 5 different stages or why these different stages exist. The first 2 exist because of lack of birth control, so that leads to high birth rates. And poor education around family planning. You have lots of children born to replace those that die very frequently due to very high infant mortality rates. You have children who needed to help work on the land, and so this leads to higher birth rates and then also higher death rates at the same time due to lack of birth control and overall poor stability on family planning and population control in the so will they ask about any of the stages, or would this be too specific? I did have an exam once ask me, they asked me about a population, and then they asked me to estimate what stage of development or what DTM stage they're in. So I did receive a question like that. It's more of you inferring on where you think they lie in development. So, for example, when you look at Japan, and Japan has a falling birth rate and they have an aging population, you'd assume that they're in stage 5, for example, which is the decline. They don't ask you to really specify, they just ask you to provide an estimate. And so it really it depends, but I think you'd get it because that's what I got in an exam once. So it's good to know on a surface level to see how you can infer. But for most cases, they won't be too strict on it. If you're unsure between two of them, it's okay, but I think they'll lean more to one category. And I have examples here of what kinds of countries fall into what categories. However, first, here you can see that there's, for example, remote tribal groups in the Amazon rainforest would fall in category 1. Poor LIC countries such as Namibia, Mali, Niger would be in number 2 because they have really, really high birth rates and very unstable death rates. You have fast industrializing countries such as India, Brazil, and Mexico in the 3rd category. You have HICs in the 4th, and you have very highly developed countries such as Japan, who are experiencing a trend of aging population in category 5. I wish I had a photo for you guys. It would make this make much more sense. However, unfortunately, I do not at the moment. However, as you can see, it's just different stages of population development. So the first two are are when the development of a country is at its earliest. So high birth rates, very unstable population growth to maximize the carrying capacity of the certain area. And then 3 and 4 is when things start to slow, and when they start to reach its stability. So, and that's when healthcare is introduced, more food supply, and there's more sanitation, there's more medical care, there's more food, water. And then the 5th one is when there's a high aging population. And so that has a higher proportion of people reaching their life expectancy, and the birth rate decreases. So, yes. So here's why there'd be a change, and here are some examples. So yes, I'll move on. So the strengths of using such a model is that it can be applied to multiple different settings, and it can also help demographers plan for predicted future changes. But for example, the limitations is that it developed in 1929 with many countries still under colonial rule. And so the model assumes all countries will follow the same pathway of growth. And current LIC's populations change has differences. So for example, birth rate stages that are stage 1 and stage 2 are higher in lower income countries. So as you can see, only one African country, which is Niger, has a birth rate of 45 per 100 or more. And in 2000, 14 African countries were in this situation. So as you can see, the situation decreased, or like the number of countries decreased from 14 to 1. And death rates have fallen quickly for different reasons, such as availability of medicine. However, AIDS has caused the death rate to rise in some countries, specifically or particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Base populations are different, and there is a fall in fertility rates, and they have been steeper in countries in stage 3. So that means that birth rates have declined in most countries because of the availability, reliability, and education of modern contraception and family planning. So there are different demographic shifts. So not all countries follow the classic model as we showed before. For example, France skipped stage 2 because their birth rate declined really, really quickly in line with death rates. And Mexico saw an increase in birth rates, and Ireland saw falling birth rates. So basically, long story short, it shows you that this model is essentially a good indicator of population growth trends. However, they're not always ideal because not all countries go through the same process of change. Some countries go through different stages of development or have their own pathways, basically. And here, I actually do have one. So this is basically types of demographic transitions. So as you can see, for different countries, there are different, like their population changes differently. So there are unique changes based off of the unique situations. And it shows you not all countries undergo the same transition of population. Okay, natural change. Natural change occurs when birth rates and death rates differ in a place. So, for example, if birth rates are higher than death rates, then there will be a natural increase. And if death rates are higher than birth rates, there will be a natural decrease. The crude birth rate is heavily influenced by the age structure of a population. For example, in 2022, the crude birth rate varied globally. So crude birth rate means the average number of children per a single woman. So the overall global crude rate was 17 per 1,000. However, the highest was in Niger and the lowest was in South Korea and Hong Kong. And so that shows you that there's differences. And so the natural change is calculated as a percentage. As you can see here, this is the equation. It's birth rate over 1,000 minus death rate over 1,000 times 100 over 1,000. And here's an example of how it's used and how it's calculated. Population also changes when people migrate into and out of an area. So population change is also influenced by fertility rates, infant mortality rates, replacement level, and net production rate. So basically this says that a lot of different processes, a lot of different incidences with constant rates of change also influence how a population looks and how a population trend is formatted, or how a population's trend is made, basically. And an example for this is there are plenty of key terms that I just said to you that are important to learn. You might not get asked about the specifics to directly define them, though you could. However, if you can use them with confidence, you will be, you'll be compensated for it. The examiner will be pretty impressed. But it's okay. Fertility rates. For more accurate measures of fertility, the fertility rate and the TFR are used. These rates apply to women within the main range of 15 to 49, which is the main reproductive age. And this makes for a more accurate measure of fertility than just the birth rate. So the fertility rate is basically the number of lives per 1,000 women aged 15 to 49 years in a given year. So, and the total fertility rate is the average number of children that will be born alive to a single woman during her lifetime. So the total family size. So this assumes that she passes through her childbearing years, conforming to the age-specific fertility rates of a given year. So this basically means that women would give birth between the ages of 15 and 49, and that's the assumption. That's the age range in which women give birth, and that's how the rate is made. And so here are factors affecting fertility rates. So as you can see, you have demographic, again, speed. Think speed. You have demographic, social, economic, and political. So demographic is infant mortality rates, and those influence fertility. Sociocultural, you have traditions, you have religion, preference for male children, you have high number of children to show virility, you have education, especially female literacy, which helps, like the increase in female literacy and women empowerment helps lower fertility. What I mean is that when there's women empowerment, women emancipation, encouraging women to go to schools, they would focus more on their own livelihood, and so the fertility rate decreases because of more time invested in education than building a household. And so economic is that in some lower income countries, children are considered as economic assets, but because of the benefit they bring work-wise, but they're seen as a cost or a financial burden in HICs. And then politically, governments attempt to change the rate of population through policies, which we'll be talking about later. So generally, as health improves, the mortality rate decreases, and there is an accelerated population growth. However, fertility levels have been falling faster than expected. Today, the global average rate is around 2.3 children per woman. However, 50 years ago, it was double. Because LICs and MICs have had increased status and well-being of children, as I said, empowerment of women. And so here you can see the trend of declining global fertility rates over time because of multiple factors, as we said earlier. And so an exam tip is when writing about factors affecting population change, consider that each factor might change a population in different ways, depending on where in the world it is. For example, population policies restricting birth rates happen in some parts of the world, but then in other parts, they're trying to increase birth rates. So the more you explain the change, the more marks you'll receive, because the more you recognize that each country has their own unique response, the more clear and cohesive your answer will be. And so then you also have life expectancy, which measures the average age of death in a population. And you have this saying that women live longer because the death rate between men and women was fairly equal before the 19th century. However, as countries developed, men became more vulnerable to cardiovascular diseases, such as strokes and heart diseases. Due to self-destructive lifestyles such as drinking and smoking, men became less active as job roles changed from manual to desk work, and men are more likely to be involved in conflict and conscript and sign up for the military, and therefore take bigger risks with their lives. And exam tip: do not assume that improved standards of living means a longer life expectancy. While good standards of living have improved life expectancy, there are always elderly people with cancer, arthritis. So, like we're saying, don't assume that standards of living immediately means longer life expectancy. There are other factors, such as illnesses and elderly health conditions, that also impact the standard of or the life expectancy of a country. So, let me breathe. So, population structure. So, populations are structured and presented in different ways statistically. So first you have population pyramids. So this characterizes a population based off of distribution of age, sex, and so on and so forth. It is the result of the change in mortality, migration, and fertility. So those three impact the population, and these can be shown in a population pyramid, which is an illustration of the distribution of a population grouped by age and gender. It can be used to represent a population of any region, city, country, because as the population grows, the shape grows. And it can be used to identify the following groups. You can use a pyramid to look at the young dependents, old dependents, economically active, and dependency ratio. So let's look at the population pyramid first. As you can see here, this is how it looks like. So you have two sides, one for male, one for female. Narrow or tighter sections suggest that there is a fall in birth rate or increase in death rate due to either war or disaster. Larger areas or bulges can indicate the effects of large-scale migration. The top of the pyramid shows the oldest ages. Bottom of the pyramid shows, the base shows birth and infant mortality rates. Wide points show high birth rates in a certain point of history. A narrow base shows a decreasing birth rate. And then a wider female section shows that women live longer in this country than men. So as you can see, this one pyramid indicates so many factors, or tells you so much about a certain population and its growth trend. And they change over time. The shape of the pyramid changes as the country moves through different stages of demographic transition. So, right, let's go through different examples. So they're pretty. So the DTM, the demographic transition model, and the population pyramid work interchangeably. So as you can see, the different stages of a DTM also reflect in the pyramids. So as a population changes in development, and the DTM, it also has different pyramids over time. And so as you can see here, there are like different population stages reflect in two different ways, one in the DTM and one in the pyramid. And some specific examples I can see here, you have the United States. as you can see, they have a column state. So they're in the fourth stage of the demographic transition because that means they have a declining birth rate. And in migration, some countries, migration can lead to an imbalance in the population structure. So, for example, the UAE has more men than women, and because in the UAE, 29% of the population are women between the ages between the ages of 25 and 39, whereas only 10.5 of the percent of the population are women between 25 and 39. And this is the result of the migration of males to the UAE to work in oil, gas, and construction. And there's rapid population growth in some areas as a result of migration, which can lead to shortage of housing, increased traffic congestion, water and air pollution, shortage of food, lack of clean water. So here is the UAE's population pyramid. As you can see, there's a very large spike in the economically active men in the UAE because of large migration. And then for Japan, however, because they're an aging population, they have a very low birth rate, which is 6.8 per 1,000, and they have a death rate of 11.1 per 1,000. So Japan has the highest life expectancy in the world at 84.36. So as you can see here, their population pyramid gets more narrow at the bottom and gets more wide at the top, meaning that they have lower birth rates and that they're having an increase in aging population. As you can see, and then in the future, it's predicted to look much different with a declining birth rate, but then a rapid increase in the overall life expectancy. And then Mexico is different because they're having a shrinking population. The median age in Mexico is now 29.8, as you can see here. And this is because working age is different, and the population of Mexico increased from 37.8 to 127.5 million in 62 years. So a growth of 237.6%, which is a lot. And so as you can see here, the base of the pyramid is contracting, which means that there is a reducing birth rate, or the population is changing a lot due to rapid migration of young men outside of the country. So as you can see, factors such as fertility rates, birth rate, death rate, and migration all play a big role in the shaping of a population pyramid. So a tip is, when interpreting one, you need to look at the 4 key areas, as we said. Young dependents, working population, which is between the ages of 18 and 65, and old dependents is the age of 65 plus, and the male-female split. So you have to notice, is the birth rate high? Are there enough people of working age? Is the old dependency ratio small? And are there any noticeable differences between the number of men and women, or male-female ratio? And so you have different ratios that you can calculate. So for example, you have the dependency ratio, which is the young dependents plus old dependents over working population times 100, which basically means how much of the population relies on the economically active to support them. For example, children ages 0 to 14 rely on their economically active parents to support them. Oh, I made a mistake. It's 15 to 64, not 18 to 64. And for example, you also have, as the population from ages 15 to 64 work and provide for the economy, you have the rest of the population, both the young and the old, who rely on them for their quality of life or for their livelihoods. So that's basically what the ratio means. And to calculate it, it's young plus old over working population times 100. And so the higher the percentage means the more income is being produced, and an aging population would have a very high dependency ratio because the population would have a very, very high birth rate. And the dependency ratio is based due to youthful population, due to a large. So basically, this means multiple different factors impact the dependency ratio. Here's an example of different countries and their different dependency ratios based off of the percentage of their population. The limitations of this is that it assumes that people under 15 and over 65 are outside the labor force. But for example, for the UK, they have a retirement age of 67, and so the minimum working age is different. An exam tip is don't worry about remembering the data because it would have changed over time. However, what is important is to remember the equation and synthesize the equation or the pyramid to the information. So trying to extract as much information as possible from the pyramid you're seeing. All right. My bad. Ooh, wait 1 sec. Okay, let's move to megacity growth. So, megacities are cities with a population of over 10 million people. The consequences of megacity growth is many cities are sprawling into it, and and as you can see, there are many around the world. As you can see, Asia in its own has at least 33 of them, including Mumbai, Delhi, India, Shanghai, Seoul, and so on and so forth. My bad. And as you can see here, you can see the distribution of megacities around the world. Vast majority of them are in Asia, specifically Eastern Asia. But you can see that there is a rise of megacities around the world. And what are the consequences of these? So, economic development. So, megacities dominate the national economies of the country. And many companies would have their headquarters in these megacities, turning them into economic hubs. This encourages population growth, which leads to the desirability or the high demand of goods and services in the megacity. All megacities act as service centers within the formal economic sector. However, you have megacities in middle-income countries are also important in manufacturing, such as Mumbai or Dhaka, with thousands working in the informal economy. Megacities also lead to population growth because young people are drawn to live in megacities. There's also internal growth where people move into the cities, have children, so there is a vast population growth within the megacity itself. And there's also there's also economies of scale, which means that cheaper to provide goods and services are provided in one place rather than spread across several cities. So, as I said earlier, these megacities become hubs. So, they will be the center of cheaper goods, better services, and so everything will be centralized in the megacity due to the large population and the large flows. And there's a multiplier effect. So that means that as the city prospers, it acts as a beacon. So it attracts people, it attracts businesses, it attracts investment, it attracts development, it attracts growth. So it turns into its own system, and this cycle multiplies the positive effects and the continuous growth. However, you have to see that there's both positive and negative. So you have to evaluate megacity growth both positively and negatively. So for individuals, the positives are improved education, higher wages, better employment, and young, vibrant, and fast-paced. Like that's what the megacity would be. However, the downside is it's overcrowded, expensive, inadequate housing, there's degraded water and sanitation, public and health services are overstretched, and it's a fast-paced environment, and it could lead to noise and noise pollution, which could impact mental and physical health. And then in a societal scale, the positives are cultural diversity, social cohesion, increased economic growth, increased services, but the negatives could be increased property prices, social challenges, congestion, and pollution. An exam tip is remember that HICs have had a slower development of megacities, and it's a longer development to accommodate the growth. But that doesn't mean they have issues. They all have issues, but it's not as visible as it is in MICs and LICs because they would have the faster growth larger populations, which makes their inequalities and chaos more visible. So recognize that there are both strengths, limitations, challenges in both HICs and MICs and LICs, but MICs and LICs have more visible challenges. So, case study time. So you have Mumbai. Mumbai is a very popular case study for megacities because it's always been a significant trading point, and it is the wealthiest city on the northwest coast of India. It is originally a number of separated islands. However, Mumbai was joined through large-scale land reclamation. Mumbai is India's most populous city, and its growth has been large but steady. Most of the growth is through in-migration from rural areas due to limited physical expansion. Mumbai has more millionaires and billionaires than any other Indian cities, but it also has the highest rates of poverty. So as you can see here is a map of Mumbai. And as you can see, there is a very, very, very high concentration of people. And you can see that it has the second busiest airport in India. It has Dharavi, which is the largest slum in India, and it's home to over 1 million plus people. And so Mumbai is really important to India. Approximately 3 million people commute daily into the city for work. Mumbai contributes 40% of India's entire tax revenue. And also Mumbai is really important globally. It's the most globalized city in Southeast Asia, and it has the largest number of TNCs, which are transnational companies, including GlaxoSmithKline, Volkswagen, Tata Steel, etc., etc. It's a global transport hub, largest foreign investment center, home to the largest film industry in the world, Bollywood, and it is the center for design and fashion. However, there are multiple consequences as well. Though being very positive, 75% of Mumbai's population lives in the slum, which is called Dharavi, which is 2 kilometers squared, and it is the largest in India with a population of 1 million people, which is insane. 80% of dry waste is recycled by inhabitants, so they do it themselves. Literacy rate is 89.73%. The sex ratio is 853 women per 1,000 men, and the per capita income is 3 times the national income. But then on a societal consequence, there's high population density. 11,000 tons of rubbish is produced daily, making Mumbai the most wasteful city in India. There's a lack of water resources. The energy infrastructure is not sufficient to accommodate growing needs, and disparity between the rich and poor is very prominent and very large. All right, so forced migration versus internal displacement. So what is migration? Migration is the move of people across a specified boundary. You have either national, international, in order to establish a new permanent or semi-permanent place of residence. The United Nations defines permanent as a change of residence lasting more than 1 year. Migration could be split into many subgroups. So there are 3 types of movement. You have cyclic, which are journeys that begin and end at a place of origin, such as commuting from work. You go to work, you go back, you form a cycle. Periodic is longer time is spent away from the place of origin, but movement involves return at some point. So that includes going to university, military, migrant. You go for a longer period of time, but you'll eventually come back. Migration is permanent move away, which means you go, but you don't come back. It's significant distance, either internally or internationally. So, here are some terms for migration. It's just different branches of migration, or how you can split migration into different kinds. So I'll just say some of them. For example, emigrant with an E is a person who migrates out of a country. Immigrant is someone who migrates in. And so these are just different ways to split migration into different categories. And migration is classified by multiple reasons, such as distance traveled, reason for travel, period of time, and volume of migrants. So here is a simplified table. So you have both voluntary and forced migration, both internally and externally. So internally means within a country or within an area, but externally means from one place to another. So for example, voluntary internal ones would be rural to urban migration for jobs, or the opposite, urban to rural for retirement. External would be, for example, the West Indians to the UK or UK doctors to the USA. That's voluntary by choice. Forced migration is without choice. For example, internal would be Chinese villagers along the Three Gorges Dam, natural disasters. External would be African people to America through the Atlantic slave trade. You have Asians from Uganda, or you have Muslims forced from India to Pakistan. So that's when forced migration was set to happen. So here are some more migrant terminologies. So there's a difference between a refugee, internally displaced, and an asylum seeker. A refugee is a person who was forced to leave their home because of a well-founded fear of persecution. An internally displaced person is someone who has been forced to leave their home, but they remain in the same country. An asylum seeker is someone who's left their country and is awaiting refugee status. So that's just the different labelings of different types of migrants. Yes. So the forced migration. Forced migration, as you can see, for example, in the Atlantic slave trade, it was the largest and most devastating externally forced migration in the history of humanity. Forced migration can be due to environmental and or human factors, and forms of forced migration include disaster-induced, development-induced, conflict-induced, and political-induced displacement. So we'll break those down. Okay, so disaster-induced displacement includes natural disasters such as hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, etc. Human-induced disasters such as the release of gas, chemicals, radiation, etc. So here are some examples. Natural, you have the eruption of the Soufriere Hills volcano on the Caribbean island of Montserrat. And human-induced, you have global warming, you have the wildfires in California. And so this is like different kinds of disaster-induced displacement. And here's development-induced displacement, which means people who are removed from their homes when large projects are undertaken. So for example, with the Three Gorges Dam, they wanted to build a dam over a river, and so they forced people out of their homes in order to do so. So direct, and so the Three Gorges Dam is an example of direct development-induced displacement. That's a very big DIDR. Let's just say DIDR. It's a example of primary DIDR. So the Three Gorges Dam was a hydroelectric dam which displaced over 1.4 million people. And then an indirect example is, for example, mining activities and poor management leads people to leave due to numerous issues, such as contamination, air pollution, and increased ill health. So those are two different. Conflict, oh yes, is when people leave due to violence such as civil war or persecution. There can be internally displaced people or refugees from the same conflict. For example, Sudanese people who are displaced in Darfur itself, which is within the country, or they go to Chad. That's two different kinds of conflict-induced displacement. And you have political. So, for example, people who are forced to migrate because of their country's policies that discriminate against them. So, for example, desperate Vietnamese refugees fled by hundreds of thousands after the communist government took control of the country in 1975, and up to 300,000 people were forced into hard labor, and so this forced them to leave. And so here are some consequences. As I said earlier, look at it through speed. Demographic is intermarriages are created, new groups of people. Socially, migration brings different people together, leading to conflicts, butting heads. Migration also creates understanding between different groups of people, social awareness. Economically, though, it depends on different factors. And other populated areas, immigration may slow down development. So if more people leave a certain area, that their development of said area will decline. Environmental would be increased pressure on food, resources, and services on the host country. And so there are lots of disadvantages, a lot of them. I won't say all of them, but some examples would be lower wages, as migrants would be happy to fill unskilled jobs for less pay, loss of key workers in the country of origin. There's a rise in informal employment. There's creation of ghettos in urban areas, isolation and exclusion from the country's population, and integration can be difficult. However, there are also positive, such as migrants will send remittances back to families at home. Remittances is sending money back home. Migrants increase the amount of taxes paid to the government. It lowers unemployment rate, and host countries are enriched by cultural diversity as migrants bring innovation and energy. Case study time. So, case study Syria. So, Syria's civil war created a really big displacement and refugee crisis in recent times. It has affected millions of people, and it's it's affected my country as well because I come from Lebanon. Because it borders Lebanon to the southwest. You have the Mediterranean, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel. So here's Syria, basically. And the cause of the migration, of course, is the Syrian crisis, which was an ongoing armed conflict between forces of the government and those opposing them. And so you had Bashar al-Assad, who was the president. His government used deadly force to crush protests against his regime, and so that led to people forced to leave their homes. And the Syrian conflict led to more than 500,000 deaths and 13.3 million people displaced. And 6.7 million people are internally displaced, with 5.5 living in the 5 countries that neighbor them, which are Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. Turkey hosts over 3.6 million refugees, and this is the largest refugee population hosted by a single country worldwide. And as you can see here, this is the number of Syrian refugees per destination. As you can see, Turkey has 3.6, Lebanon has 0.86, Jordan has 0.66, Egypt has 0.14, and Iraq has 0.24. So, lots of impacts on Syria. Social impact, loss of life, lost their homes. Children have been exposed to violence. More than 2 million children are out of school, and 1.6 million children are at risk of dropping out. Girls are forced to marry young, and lots of displacement. Economically, we have businesses and industries have been damaged or disrupted, and the conflict has destroyed lots of infrastructure. Environmentally, the land is flattened by bombing, making it very difficult to cultivate crops. Wildlife and ecosystems are destroyed. Impact on Jordan, the Zaatari refugee camps in Jordan is 10 kilometers away from the border. It is home to 80,000 people. It remains the largest refugee camp in the Middle East and one of the largest in the world. Over 20,000 births have been recorded in the refugee camp itself. And Jordan, however, is the second most water-scarce country in the world, so many people live in tents. Sanitation is limited, with overflowing toilets and raw sewage. Impacts on Lebanon, there's an overwhelming burden on infrastructure. Most refugees live in poverty and child labor is common, and Lebanon has the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. Impacts on Syria, Syrian refugees mostly settled in refugee camps in southeastern Turkey. And an exam tip is you may be asked to either explain the causes for forced migration or analyze the impact. Therefore, it is important you have facts and figures and recent examples of forced migration to hand. So if you're asked about it, it's really good to have this case study understood on a whole, both on how it happened and who it impacted. And another case study is Nigeria. It all started because of political insecurity. So the district of Borno in northern Nigeria was a significant agricultural trading hub. However, in 2014, the Boko Haram group kidnapped 276 Christian schoolgirls from Chibok, Borno. The group is known for its extreme violence, and 3 years later, 82 of the girls were released in exchange for 5 Boko Haram leaders. As a result, over 2.2 million people have been forced to flee the area, as some of the girls had been made to carry suicide bombs and explode them in busy areas. What was initially seen as a Nigerian problem moved across the borders into northern Cameroon, western Chad, southeastern Niger due to the forced displacement. People in the region have suffered losses such as homes, families, and lack of access to fresh water and services. And so this is a map showing the Borno district and how easy it is for people to go from Borno to Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, and that's what happened. So what were the consequences, though? Consequences was environmentally, there was very little support that was provided to rebuild the lives or homes of people. So fuel was costly, and charcoal became the alternative energy used in Borno. There's been a rise of civilian vigilante self-defense groups to protect their land and home. And outside of the region, a further 540,000 people have been internally displaced due to severe floods. Overall, the impact of Boko Haram has been economic and political by creating a state of insecurity in northern Nigeria. Okay, so before I move on to 1.3, are there any questions regarding all of what I just said? I know it was a lot. Thank you for bearing. But is there anything else about any questions about what I just said? So about demographic models, megacities, internal forced migration, displacement. Oh yes, I love the Tetris extension. It helps me survive class as well. Yes, I'll be sending the document later. So the things that I skipped over, you'll be able to look back at them for sure. All right. So if there are no questions, let's move to our last part, which is challenges and opportunities. So you have many trends in family size. So family size is linked with economic development. So larger families are found in LICs and smaller families are found in HICs. So the global average household size declined from 4.9 people to 3.45. However, the country with the largest household size is Senegal, with an average of 10 family members. Pakistan, Nigeria, and India also have large families with an average of between 5 to 9 people. Smaller families are common across Europe with 2.3 people and North America with 2.6. And here are the following factors that influence the household size. You have healthcare, increase in women's education and participation in workforce, increased life expectancy of children, urbanization and lack of space for large families, cultural and societal norms, government policies restricting or encouraging family sizes. So when you're asked about global and regional trends, you do not need to specify data about all the countries of the world, but you do need to be able to mention general information on a global scale and how this varies from region to region. Knowing details about a couple of them will allow you to support your claims. So if you know some examples, that could really help. For example, some of the ones I just mentioned. Sex ratios is often referred to as a gender ratio, which is the ratio between the number of males and females in a given society. It's very dynamic, it's very fluid because it's affected by biological factors, cultural and social factors, technological factors, economic factors, and there are many differences in mortality and life expectancy rates in different places. And so the sex ratio impacts society, demographics, and the economy of the country. However, there are many global differences. So in 2021, the total share of women in the world stood at 49%. However, countries with the largest populations, such as China and India, have a male dominant society. Some countries do not register female births, so this comes down to a lot of traditional issues with countries preferring men over women, like boys over girls. So Middle Eastern countries have more men than women, mostly due to inward migration of male workers to the region. For example, Oman has a 3-to-1 ratio, whereas the UAE has almost a 4-to-1 ratio due to lots of young men migrating to the UAE for improved working conditions. In Mexico, the percentage is of men to women is 51 to around 49. So, and also the ratio varies from place to place. Employment opportunities may be more suitable to one gender or another. For example, Alaska has a lot of tough physical jobs. This is the reason why the country has the largest male-female sex ratio, state. And gender inequality exposes women to poor health, puts them at higher risk of death, including complications pre and post pregnancy and childbirth. Despite this, as a country's population ages, it is most likely to have a female majority. So, for example, countries from the former Soviet Union have been predominantly female since World War II, when millions of men died in battle. Global sex ratio. Here it is. Here's a global sex ratio. As you can see, countries such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and I think that's Oman. Yeah, that's Oman. They have the lowest sex ratios. That means lowest percentage of women However, you have countries such as Russia and Eastern Europe who have really high sex ratios. So this is also a way you can read a map. Importance of the sex ratio, however, countries which lack men or women have difficulty maintaining a birth rate which matches its death rate. So this leads to a declining population with less male workers entering the workforce. An unbalanced sex ratio usually affects crime rates, marital stability, and a woman's decisions to either focus on a career or start a family. So there are multiple issues with the sex ratio as well. Sex ratio varies with age. Men usually outnumber women at birth, but have a higher mortality rate. Therefore, by the age of 50 plus, women usually outnumber men. And so for aging, also known as the gray population, the over 60 plus, every country sees a growth in size and percentage of older people as they develop. So the number of people aged 60 plus years in 2020 outnumbered children younger than 5 in the world. And in 2022, almost 10% of the world's population were aged 65 plus. And so, as you can see, this just means that it's increasing. And specifically in places with a high elderly population, in Japan, Italy, and Finland, they have really high ones. So 30%, 24%, 23%. But for example, in countries such as Qatar, Uganda, Afghanistan, they only have 2% of the population aged 65 and plus. So why? Why do we have such an aging, graying population? For example, globally, immigration usually offsets the effects of a country's aging population, as immigrants are usually younger. So more immigrants distorts the graph, distorts the ratio. But for example, immigrants from countries with high family numbers, with each generation will reduce the number of children they have as they begin to integrate to their immigrated country. Also, as populations age and falling fertility rates are a global occurrence, future trends might change in migration. So, population mental policies. So, aging population impacts. They increase costs on accommodation, social services such as schools, sports centers decline because they're not used by older people. Family budgets can increase if looking after an aged relative. There is an increase in the dependency ratio because of a smaller working population. And aging populations can also present opportunities such as lower costs of policing as crime rates reduce, new market/business opportunities, increased opportunities for volunteering and community activism, longer working lives, more time can be spent with friends and family. And so a very, very important and famous case study, of course, is Japan with their super aged population. More than 1 in 10 people in Japan are now aged 80 plus, and there are approximately 80,000 centenarians, or people aged over 100 in Japan. This makes Japan the country with the world's oldest population, and this leads to a shrinking child population, which is forcing local governments around Japan to close its schools. And the decrease of the youth population reduces competition among young people. And so, Japan's policies, the government has tried its best to boost its birth rates. However, with the cost of living and long working hours, there is little success. And the pandemic only worsened the issues, leading to more deaths and fewer marriages. And Japan created something called the Angel Plan, which tried to help couples raise their children by increasing policies and programs for paid parental leave. And in 2020, the government increased support by reducing the cost of fertility treatment and raised child allowances. But so far, these policies have not really improved. Also, Japan also has a strict immigration policy. Migrants are considered as temporary guest workers who will eventually return home. So many Japanese firms resist hiring foreign workers. And if the foreign worker had advanced skills, they were allowed to bring their families and live in the country indefinitely. And so this allows you to look at pronatalist policies, which is what Japan tried to adopt. A pronatalist policy is adopted when a country suffers from a declining and aging population. It is a policy implemented to increase the population through encouraging births and instilling a culture of reproduction through financial or social incentives. So, for example, They're mostly concentrated in HICs because they need financial development and developmental support to be successful. And the biggest issue is it is a big cost to the government. So a case study with this is Russia. They have a very low fertility rate of 1.5 births per woman because of lack of access to contraceptives, high divorce rate, aging population, high rates of abortion, and women choosing to have less children. Their first pronatalist policy was in 1936, where families were rewarded for having 3 or more children. Abortion was a criminal offense. Childless families were penalized with an increased tax of 6.6%. And in 1981, Russia reduced the childbearing age and closed contraceptive factories. So fertility rates did not increase, but the rate of illegal abortions did, so it backfired a lot. And another plan offered an all-expense paid summer camp for young adults, complete with private tents and no condoms. So the government tried to reintroduce the childless tax as well. So they tried a lot. And so the day of conception, September 12, 2006, is when Putin announced that citizens are relieved of work and encouraged to use their afternoons to copulate. And if a child is born on June 12, 2007, the couple will receive cars. As you can see, they were trying really, really, really hard to get kids in the population, and that led to a really high change or really high cost from the government. Lots of promises, lots of silly promises. Not silly, but they tried their best. And then on the other side, though, you have anti-natalist policies, which is the complete opposite. The aim of anti-natalist policies is to reduce pressure on resources and improve the quality of life to inherently reduce the birth rate. So this is when a population is growing way too rapidly and the country is trying to decrease it. A very, very, very popular example is China with their one-child policy. The rapid increasing population resulted in limited resources such as food, housing, education, and healthcare. And by the early 1970s, China was once again heading into a famine unless the government brought changes. So China implemented their one-child policy in 1979 and ended in 2016. However, it was kind of relaxed in 1999. But this policy specified that couples must not marry until their late 20s. They can only have one successful pregnancy. They must be sterilized after the first child, which means, they have to force themselves. Anyways, or they have to abort any future pregnancies. They would receive a 5 to 10% salary rise for limiting their family to one child, increased access to contraceptives, better employment opportunities, and abortion is legalized. The punishments, though, 10% salary cut, a fine so large that it would bankrupt most households. The family would have to pay for the education. Second children born abroad were not penalized but could not become Chinese citizens. The policy was stricter in urban areas. However, exceptions were ethnic minorities, rural families, especially if the first was a girl. Urban couples could have a second child, but only if both parents were single children. Multiple births, twins, were not penalized, and many women took fertility drugs to have multiple births. And the policy is estimated to have reduced population growth. However, it also created issues, such as 400 million. Advantages, though, is that 400 million fewer people have been born, the famine never occurred, population growth has slowed enough, and the population growth rate has decreased. However, disadvantaged women were forced to have abortions, even as late as 9 months into the pregnancy, which is really unhealthy. Women were placed under pressure from families, friends. Little Emperor Syndrome was where only children became really spoiled. Chinese society has a preference for sons, so then there was a high rate of female infanticide or girls being placed in orphanages. And local officials and central governments had power over people's private lives. And the biggest impact has been shrinking labor force, aging population of nearly 450 million people aged 60 plus, and a gender imbalance. So, equality and trafficking policies. So, gender equality in Kerala, India. Gender inequality is common around the world, and women remain underrepresented. There has been some improvement in equality, namely maternal mortality, literacy rates, and many countries are progressing in the workplace. It is in HICs where the biggest gains in equality have occurred. However, women do still face rising costs and job insecurities. Women face long-established societal barriers that limit their ability to adapt to new working environments, and women have less access to technology, and there's lower participation in science, technology, engineering, and math fields than men. So, in Kerala, India, gender equality is well established through patriarchal views, gender norms, and structures. Even though girls have a higher survival rate from birth, India is the only large country where more girls die than boys, and girls are more likely to drop out of school. Indian girls are more likely to face restrictions on freedom of movement and decisions. Wife beating is considered justified if she neglects or disrespects the house, children, in-laws, or husband. Only 25% of Indian women enter the formal workplace, and most women are employed in agriculture. Only 7% work in professional, technical, or managerial occupations. And so, what happened in Kerala, though? Kerala is known as a progressive region because of its high levels of social development. Kochi City is Kerala's financial and industrial capital. The region has improved healthcare, literacy rates, and lowered its birth rates. And Kerala recognizes the status of women as being important to its development. So girls are educated to the same standard, open access to colleges. Women often study medical sciences. Jobs are open to both. Women have some autonomy over their personal lives. And so what happened then in Kerala was that the sex ratio stood at 1,084 female per 1,000 men, and Kerala had an infant mortality rate of 6 per 1,000, compared to a national rate of 26.6. And so, although Kerala had gender parity, women were still marginalized, however. Violence and sexual harassment towards women were common. Women lacked economic control. Although education is equal, 70% of the women are unemployed as opposed to just 18% of educated men. They are more likely to be employed in low-wage jobs, such as agriculture, and it is still the female who has domestic responsibilities. There are self-help groups, and even with numerous achievements and improvements in Kerala, there are still issues surrounding gender parity. It is important for Kerala and India to improve through job opportunities, corporate policies, and programs that address deep-rooted societal norms. All right. So next we go to trafficking. We're almost done, by the way. Trafficking and anti-trafficking policies. So human trafficking remains a really serious global issue. The USA's Traffic and Violent Protection Act, or the TVPA, defines severe forms of trafficking in persons as you have sex trafficking, where commercial sexual acts are introduced by force, fraud, or coercion. You have modern slavery, which is the recruitment, keeping, transporting, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through force, fraud, or manipulation for the purpose of controlling a person. So you have patterns. The patterns are that even though all human trafficking cases have individual characteristics, most follow the same pattern, which is people who are abducted or recruited in the country and then transferred through regions and then exploited in another country. So past trafficking would have been between two nations. However, now it is more likely to happen across multiple regions. And the UN included anti-trafficking measures in 3 of its 17 Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. Both the US and the UN produce annual reports on global trafficking and encourage governments to join the fight. Risks. There are many different kinds of populations who are more at risk, such as religious minorities, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA people, refugees, migrants, and the homeless. However, there are multiple costs. It is difficult to evaluate the full scope. However, the ILO estimated that 49.6 million people are trapped in modern slavery today, and this industry is worth $150 billion a year. And of these, 27.6 are enforced labor, 22 are enforced marriages, and 3.3 are children in forced labors. And women and girls account for 4.9 million in commercial sexual exploitation and 6 million in forced labor. 12% of all of these enforced labor are children, with more than half in commercial sexual exploitation. And Asia and Pacific region have the highest number of people in forced labor, and the U.S. Department of Labor has identified 159 goods from 78 countries made by forced labor and child labor. The most common are cotton, coffee, rice, clothing, footwear and textiles, gold, coal, and diamonds. So there has to have been policies made, right? However, it is unlikely that any single country or policy will end human trafficking, unfortunately. However, governments have attempted to reduce trafficking through public awareness and designing policies. Roughly 90% of countries have agreed the UN 2003 protocol to prevent, support, and punish trafficking in person, especially for women and children. This protocol has helped to increase criminalization of trafficking, and there are still some 2 billion people who live in areas where trafficking is not criminalized. So you have 8 countries in Africa and the Middle East who lack anti-trafficking legislation, which leaves a number of people unprotected and at risk. Convictions. In 2022, a total of 5,600 human traffickers were convicted worldwide, which is low, although it is only an increase of around 300 convictions from the year before and 30% lower than pre-COVID. Governments and NGOs believe that confiscating proceeds from crime is effective punishment. And to date, however, unfortunately, there is little support for the victims. All right, what is a demographic dividend? Demographic dividend is the economic growth potential that can result from shifts in a population's age structure. So, for example, it describes how a country's dependency ratio falls quickly as it goes through a period of fast economic growth. Population structures are divided into 3 age group categories, as we mentioned before. Therefore, the dividend occurs when the share of the working age is larger than the non-working age. So when the working age population makes a lot of economic contributions to the country. According to the UN, Asia and Latin America have been the main beneficiaries, and countries in sub-Saharan Africa are yet to benefit. What are the benefits of the demographic dividend? There are 4 areas of benefits. Labor supply, there will be an increase in the workforce and women are more likely to have a job. Savings, as the economy grows, wages rise and personal savings grow. There's more disposable income to purchase goods and services, which further contributes to the economy, human capital, and economic growth. The benefits assume that governments invest in suitable social, political, and economic policies to support family planning, healthcare, education, job opportunities. Demographic dividend is not guaranteed, and the size of the benefit depends on multiple factors. So, here's a case study. South Korea's demographic dividend began in the 1960s, after the Korean War. In 1962, South Korea's total fertility rate was 6.3 births per woman. This is well below the replacement level, and so it made South Korea the country with the lowest fertility rate in the world. Life expectancy increased from 53 years in 1960 to 83 years in 2022 because there were lots of reforms in public health, family planning, education linked with economic growth, and so they are a textbook definition of demographic dividend. So here were 4 areas of which their demographic dividend grew. So you have labor supply, savings, human capital, and economic growth. So for example, for human capital, South Korea overhauled its education system to be more equal, and this led to one of the most educated populations in the world. 69.8% of South Koreans aged 25 to 34 have completed some form of tertiary education. And yeah, here we are. And so this is, oh, we're done. Okay, so this is it. If you have any questions, if you need me to run by anything that I just mentioned, let me know. I will be posting this document though. And yes, I didn't realize we were done. I was on a spree. But yes, thank you guys for coming. If you have any questions, just type it. I'll get to it right now. I'll download a copy of this as we speak so that I can share it with you guys in case you want to look at it again. Let me download a copy. And if you want to look at it again, it would be good to have it just lying with you guys. So that's a pretty hefty document, so many pages. But yes, I hope you guys benefited from the session. Thank you guys for coming. I wish you all a great day and great luck with your revising. And yeah, I hope it all goes well. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. But again, yes, let me download it for you guys and send it over so you guys can look over it. All right, amazing. So then it's nighttime for me, so good night to you all. Have a great rest of your day and see you at the next session. All right, see you guys.